Inflation is rising, and families are paying more for groceries, more for health care, more for utilities, more for housing, all thanks to Trump's chaotic tariffs and one big, beautiful bill. And now his war with Iran is putting American troops in harm's way and further driving up the cost of nearly everything here at home. Second, in your testimony, you said it's perfectly fine for elected officials to state their views on interest rates. But that is not what Donald Trump is doing. The president has repeatedly and illegally attempted to take over the Fed. His bogus attacks on Governor Lisa Cook and Chair Powell were designed to threaten all the members of the Fed to do Trump's bidding and open more spots for Trump flunkies. Why try to end the independence of the Fed? Because Trump's economic failures are causing him political problems, and he wants the Fed to use monetary policies to artificially juice the economy in the short term, and this is his last chance to do that before the November elections. Having a sock puppet in charge of the Fed would also give the president access to the Fed's powerful authorities to enrich himself, his family, and his Wall Street buddies. It could mean granting special accounts to his family's crypto company or bailouts to his friends on Wall Street if they get into trouble. In other words, a Fed under Donald Trump's control creates more opportunities for Trump's corruption. Third, the nominee before us today, Kevin Warsh, is uniquely ill-suited for the job as Fed chair. In our meeting last week, we discussed the 2008 financial crash, where 8 million people lost their jobs, 10 million people lost their homes, and millions more lost their life savings. Giant banks, however, got hundreds of billions of dollars in bailouts. Mr. Warsh was a Fed governor from 2006 to 2011. That's before, during, and after the crash. And he said to me that he has no regrets about anything he did. So let's take a deeper dive into Mr. Warsh's record. In the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, he was an enthusiastic cheerleader for credit default swaps and complex securitizations. He dismissed repeated and increasingly urgent concerns from housing advocates across the country regarding subprime mortgages. He refused to use the Fed's authorities to address the risks that were building in the financial system. And when the crisis hit and the economy blew up, Warsh took on the job of Wall Street's personal liaison on the Fed board. He was quick to respond to concerns from Wall Street CEOs, and he worked tirelessly to arrange multi-billion-dollar bailouts for them with nothing for American families. No regrets, he says, no regrets. After the crash, most people on the Fed saw millions of Americans unemployed, people who had lost their homes, and said now might be a good time to lower rates and make the cost of borrowing cheaper for businesses to avoid more layoffs and make it cheaper for Americans who are worried about paying their mortgages or their credit cards. But not Mr. Warsh. Nope. He wanted to keep interest rates high. And he sang the same song for more than a decade, even as the economy struggled. When the job of Fed chair became available during Trump's first term as president, Warsh held on to his high interest rate inflation hawk views, and Trump passed him by. Regretful, he soon reversed course and called for the Fed to pause interest rate hikes. Then, once Trump left office, Mr. Warsh flipped again and was even criticizing the Fed for cutting rates in the fall of 2024. But as soon as Donald Trump became president a second time, Warsh reversed himself once more and began shouting from the rooftops about how the Fed should cut interest rates. Evidently, he learned his lesson. This time around, he sucked up to Donald Trump to snag his dream job. Mr. Chairman, last week, every single Democratic member of this committee asked that you postpone this hearing and instead conduct oversight on the president's role in directing bogus criminal probes into Chair Powell and Governor Cook. The Senate should not be aiding and abetting Donald Trump's illegal takeover of the Fed by installing his chosen sock puppet as chair. It's an invitation for corruption and for economic catastrophe. We have the power to stop it, and we should be using that power.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your consideration today. I've known you for quite a while, and I certainly appreciate the many courtesies you've given me, not just since the president's nomination, but long before. It's an honor to be with you, with Ranking Member Warren, and with the entire committee. I'm deeply grateful to President Trump for asking me to take on this public trust, because that's what it is, a public trust. The president believes that real economic growth in the U.S. and real take-home pay will accelerate. I share the president's confidence in our country and its people. America's economic growth potential is rising as we sit here today. I'm also especially happy that my wife Jane is here. She's been with me for many of the most important moments in my life. I'm grateful for her love and her personal accomplishments. I reciprocate that with somewhat of my own love, though I'm a little more stoic than she. And about every 20 years, I reintroduce her to this committee. She sat behind me 20 years ago, and it was almost 20 years ago to the day. And so let me offer today what I said then. Jane, happy anniversary. I'm also thinking of my late mom and dad. They were paying great attention to this hearing 20 years ago. They're no longer with us, but I was always proud of them and the values they taught me, and I hope they'd be proud of me today. We start today with a note of broad agreement, even though we might have heard different narratives at the outset of this hearing. This is a time of great consequence for the nation's economy. As a former Fed governor and friend or colleague of the last 5 Fed chiefs, from whom I've learned plenty of lessons, I'm particularly alert to the challenges and opportunities confronting the institution that I cherish, the Federal Reserve. To the President, to the Congress, the nation, I owe my best judgment and my most faithful efforts in serving the mission that you and Congress assigned to the Federal Reserve, including full employment and stable prices. The American people are counting on the Fed to deliver on its commitments, perhaps now more than ever. The real highlights of my life are not on my resume, as Senator McCormick said. They include the individuals with whom I worked and from whom I learned. I graduated from high school in upstate New York. I had some exceptional teachers there and some brilliant classmates. I've learned we're lucky in life if we start out with good influences in learning and in character. A public school education gave me both of these, and I'm grateful. I made my way to Stanford and found myself in the company of some of the most highly accomplished economists and policymakers. George Shultz, former Secretary of State and Treasury, was among the great patriots at the Hoover Institution, who I came to know as a teacher, mentor, and friend. He passed away right after COVID at age 100, but I still feel him with me. I could not have imagined a better formative experience than working from and learning from folks like him. I could tell you about all the things I learned, but maybe the most important was to be around people completely devoted to the ideas and ideals of our country. Silicon Valley in the early 90s, another fitting backdrop for all the things we confront today. I found myself in the right place at the right time. The U.S. was at the vanguard of a new era of technological leadership, and I just looked out my door to see it. Now, in the last 15 years, I've gained deep experience in macro and in markets, working with Stan Druckenmiller. He never held a position in government, but is no less a patriot. He never got a PhD in economics, but I don't know a finer economic thinker. Without their guidance and the guidance of Condi Rice, my friend and I should say my boss at the Hoover Institution, I doubt I would be sitting before you today as the president's Fed chairman nominee. But I'm certain of one thing. Absent their tutelage, absent their example, I would not be as prepared for the urgent, mission-critical task at hand. In between these bookend experiences, I served quite a while ago as a governor at the Federal Reserve. At the onset of the financial crisis, as Senator Warren said, our central bank played an indispensable role, and we benefited enormously from the credibility that our predecessors had built up and passed down to us, governors of the Fed at the time. In these unusual and exigent circumstances, I saw the Fed and its people at their very best. But I also witnessed an institution that was tempted to play a larger role in the economy and society. So let me be very clear. Monetary policy independence is essential. Monetary policy makers must act in the nation's interest. Their decisions the product of rigor, deliberation, and unclouded decision-making. And as Senator Warren said, I do not believe that independence of monetary policy is threatened when elected officials state their views on rates. Fed independence is up to the Fed. That has three implications. First, Congress is tasked with the mission to ensure price stability. Inflation is the Fed's choice. Second, Fed independence is at its peak in the conduct of monetary policy. And third, as the chairman said, the Fed must stay in its lane. I'm committed to ensuring that the conduct of monetary policy remains strictly independent, equally committed to work with the administration and Congress on non-monetary matters that are part of the Fed's remit, and I commit myself to accountability. Finally, I'll just say this, Mr. Chairman. Milton Friedman had a phrase that always stayed with me. He always worried about government officials that lured and hung around with what he called the tyranny of the status quo. Status quo practices and policies are especially harmful when the world is changing this fast. If confirmed as chairman, I will be faithful to the Constitution, to the Federal Reserve Act, and to the very best of the Fed's traditions. I believe a reform-oriented Fed can make a real difference to the American people. And if confirmed, I will seek to create an environment in which the best people do their best work. Candor and goodwill will go a long way in pursuing those objectives. And I suspect this hearing, Mr. Chairman, will put us to the test. It's a real privilege to be here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the Fed has been plagued by deeply disturbing ethics scandals in recent years involving at least 6 Fed officials. So it's critical that the next chair have no financial conflicts, none. You have more than $100 million in investments that you have refused to disclose to ethics officials and to the public. So let me ask, do the Juggernaut Fund or the THSDFS LLC invest in any companies affiliated with President Trump or his family, companies that have facilitated money laundering, Chinese-controlled companies, or financing vehicles established by Jeffrey Epstein?
Senator Warren, thank you. So let me first share a point of agreement with you. The Fed has 2 tools. One is its monetary policy, and the second is its credibility. And the scandals that you talked about, the ethics problems you talked about, went to the core of the credibility that has hurt the Fed.
Could you answer my question, please? I asked. You have $100 million in undisclosed assets. And what I'm asking is, are any of those with this outfit that invests in companies affiliated with President Trump or his family, companies that have facilitated money laundering, Chinese-controlled companies, or financing vehicles set up by Jeffrey Epstein? It's a yes or no question.
Senator, I have worked tirelessly with the ethics officials at the Office of Government Ethics.
And you have not
come to an ethics agreement with them
and
have agreed, Senator, to sell all of my financial assets, including the Duquesne assets.
Are you refusing to tell us if you have investments, for example, in vehicles set up to advance Jeffrey Epstein? Is that what you're telling us? You just won't tell us?
Senator, what I'm telling you is that those assets that you represent at Juggernaut will be sold if I'm confirmed before I take office and sign the oath of office.
Let me follow up on that. will you at least disclose how you plan to disclose and divest these secret assets? I'm sure you understand that the public might question your motives if, for example, billionaire Stanley Druckenmiller, who you honored in your opening statement, and who makes a living guessing what the Fed will do next, cuts you a massive check for $100 million as you take the oath of office to become the new Federal Reserve Chair.
Senator, as you know, it sounds like your fight might not be with me, but the Office of Government Ethics. I have come to full agreement with them and have agreed to divest all of those assets,
I'm asking
especially
you a very
those that you
straightforward
referenced
question,
before I
Mr.
take
Warsh,
the oath of office.
And that is, will you disclose how you divest those assets, or will you just collect a check for $100 million from someone whose whole business is betting on what the Fed will do?
As I said to the ethics officials at the Federal Reserve and the Office of Government Ethics, they agreed,
I'll take that as a no as well.
I would be redeeming my assets
Donald
before
Trump
I take
has made clear that he does not want an independent Fed. In fact, he has said, and I quote, "Anybody that disagrees with me will never be Fed chairman." And he's made clear that you are his sock puppets, saying last week that interest rates will drop, quote, "when Kevin gets in." Yeah, I think they do. Not when economic conditions change, we'll get lower rates. Not when the economy needs it. Nope. He said, when my guy, Kevin Warsh, is in there, we'll get the interest rates that I, Donald Trump, wants. So independence takes courage. Let's check out your independence and your courage. We'll start easy. Mr. Warsh, did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
We try to keep politics, if I'm confirmed, out of the Federal
I'm just
Reserve.
asking you a factual question. I need to know, I need to measure your independence and your courage.
Senator, I believe that this body certified that election many years ago.
That's not the question I'm asking. I'm asking, did Donald Trump lose in 2020?
And I'm suggesting you in 2020, the Fed made a huge inflation problem, and you certified the election.
So let me ask you another question.
Out of monetary policy.
In our meeting, you said you would be independent because you're, quote, a tough guy. Those were your words, tough guy. And you will be able to stand up to President Trump. So let's try it again. Name one aspect of President Trump's economic agenda with which you disagree.
Well, Senator, the Federal Reserve in recent years has wandered outside of its remit, wandered into other areas.
I'm asking for something
That's not something I'm prepared to do.
Trump on.
If I'm confirmed, the Federal Reserve should stay in its lane.
Just one little place where you disagree with Donald Trump.
Well, I do have a disagreement, actually, Senator, with the president. I think even this morning he said that he thought I was out of central casting. I think central casting, I'd look older, grayer, and maybe show up here with a cigar of sorts.
Quite adorable. But, you know, we need a Fed chair who is independent. That's the only way we preserve the independence of the Federal Reserve. If you can't answer these questions, you don't have the courage and you don't have the independence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Warsh, congratulations. You can't count this as a date with Jane, particularly this one. I think probably the first hearing was a little less acrimonious. I'm not going to ask you anything. You can take a break and get ready for the bludgeoning on the other side. They're going to beat you till you bleed, and then they're going to beat you for bleeding. I'm going to talk about what's preventing me from being in a position to vote for you until we've spent time together in my office. You have extraordinary credentials. They're impeccable. I think the way you're dealing with the ethics issue is strong. Problem I have is where we are right now. And I start by saying I love your opening statement. I love your focus on the independence of the Fed. I love the idea of Fed independence with respect to achieving the dual mandate, but Fed transparency on so many other things that the Fed does that, frankly, we're all frustrated with, bank examination, supervision being some among them that I think we should have more insight into. Mr. Chair, I'd like to submit for the record 2 executive orders under President Trump, one in 2020 and one in 2025, talking about making federal architecture beautiful again and focusing on trying to preserve the integrity of old buildings.
Without objection.
Thank you. And, Mr. Chair, I will be submitting an analysis, but if we can go to slide 2 and turn it up right. Much has been made about the building project that has Chair Powell under investigation. I'm not going to get into the details except to say that I used to work for a firm that did audit and compliance, so I'm naturally wired to go back from the ground up and figure out what the deal is. Here's what I know. The Martin building has been conflated into this project to make it a $4 billion building. Even if you put the Martin building in, it's a $3 billion building. The reality is what we're talking about is the Eccles building and the East building, for which, bring that up higher, Jack, you're a tall guy so people can see it. These are the overruns. And these overruns occurred in part because the cost of inputs went up 69% since the original estimate. Asbestos was identified. Remediation was required. Pylons had to be built underneath the building because it turns out they used it as a landfill, and they had a water table issue. There were a variety of reasons why this building went over budget. And as a matter of fact, if we put everybody in prison in federal government that had a budget go over, we'd have to reserve an area roughly the size of Texas for a penal colony because of the way government projects work. And the reality is the overage of inflation adjusted was about $730 million, the majority of which seems to be legitimate. Next slide. Not acceptable, unfortunate, but legitimate. Now, what I've really got a problem with, and we're talking about Fed independence. By the way, I think you're going to be independent. You have to be. You got to convince 11 other people to vote with you, at least the majority. It's a consensus organization. You try to get the majority to. Most of these votes are 11-1. So if anybody thinks the president can appoint somebody and you unilaterally can control things, you're going to be an unsuccessful chair if history is any guide, and you've served under some of the best. So I know you're going to do it right. The problem that I have here is that we had some U.S. attorney with a dream, or assistant U.S. attorney, thinking it would be cute to bring Chair Powell under an investigation just a few months before the position was going to be open. This happened this year. Normal course and speed. Here's how it works at the Fed. May the 15th, the term would have expired. We'd be having this hearing. You'd be getting confirmed. Custom also suggests that the sitting chair, even though he has 2 years left on his term, would have exited. But instead, we have somebody who thinks a building project that went over by about $700 million with a lot of what seemed to be justifications for it are holding up this whole process. It sounds like to me somebody over in the DOJ didn't even check with the boss. The boss said on the same night that I said I can't go forward until this bogus investigation is done with, said he didn't know anything about it. So we've got people in DOJ over in the D.C. circuit or the D.C. district doing these investigations. We have got to end this investigation. Big DOJ didn't know about it. The president didn't know about it. Let's get rid of this investigation so I can support your confirmation. Mr. Warsh, the only thing I've found the least bit odd about you is you've never watched an episode of Seinfeld. You've spent so much time at being a rock-solid economist that you're not even taking time away for a little laugh like that. I look forward to supporting your nomination, and I look forward to this investigation being taken down. If the chair wants to have all of our subcommittees start looking at capital expenditure projects for the agencies that we're overseeing, I think that's a great idea. And I'd like to be on a committee specifically drilling down on this analysis. If somebody can prove me wrong, I'd be happy to make a criminal referral. But I don't have the D.C. Circuit tell me a crime was committed when 7 members on this committee said it wasn't, including the chair.
Veteran economics reporter Ron Insana is back with us. Also joining us, Catherine Rampell, co-host of The Week in Primetime, and former deputy director of President Biden's National Economic Council, Bharat Ramamurthy. And Catherine, we're about an hour now into this hearing. We heard ranking Democrat Senator Elizabeth Warren repeatedly calling Warsh Trump's sock puppet. What else stands out to you so far, and what should we expect as this hearing continues?
There was a lot of focus on his Kevin Warsh's financial disclosures or whether they are sufficient. The thing that I would actually like to hear him question more in depth on are about his past interest rate calls, his past calls for the Fed, including the fact that I think Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, had briefly alluded to this, during the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, that era, he had been calling for tighter monetary policy when everybody else was concerned about the reverse, was concerned that we might be potentially heading into a huge and prolonged recession/depression. In fact, right after Lehman went under, the minutes from the Fed meetings suggest or show that Kevin Warsh was worried about runaway inflation. If we had followed his advice, I think we would have had a global depression at the time. So I would love to hear him talking more about that. I'm sort of perplexed that the committee members have not pressed him more on that. And, there's been some discussion about Fed independence, but I would love to hear them asking more about specific things he had said, suggesting that he may not be as respectful or as protective of Fed independence, including suggesting that it's okay for Donald Trump to weigh in.
He did say monetary policy independence is essential. He says he backs that independence of monetary policy, but is also committed to work with the administration and Congress on non-monetary matters. Can he have it both ways, Bharat?
Sure. I think traditionally the independence question is on questions of monetary policy. For me, the real issue here is that Donald Trump has been clear that he is only going to choose somebody to be Fed chair if he's confident that they're going to lower interest rates, regardless of what the data may justify under current circumstances. And now Kevin Warsh has this nomination. What guarantees, what assurances did he give to the president? And as Catherine and some of the senators have pointed out, this is a guy who was very much against interest rate cuts, even when the data clearly justified them when there was a Democrat in office. And when a Republican came to office, he suddenly changed his tune and became, strangely supportive and finding all sorts of novel and complex theories to justify cutting rates, despite the fact that the data don't really support it. So to me, that's really the key issue. We've already seen with Jay Powell how important it is to have somebody who commands the respect of Congress and of the markets. And when you have potentially a new chair who doesn't bring that level of credibility, I think it's concerning. And to that point, I think it's also a pretty bad mark against him that he wasn't able to say to a very straightforward question that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, and frankly wasn't able to say in response to a very clear factual question from Senator Van Hollen right there, that cutting interest rates dramatically would lead to an increase in prices. Those are disconcerting things to my eye.
The other thing we've heard a lot of talk is about his wealth. Warsh and his wife have incredible wealth. In his financial disclosure forms, it was estimated to be $100 million, his own wealth alone, but there were a lot that we didn't understand or wasn't detailed in those reports, which we heard Elizabeth Warren go after him on right off the bat, asking him about what is behind those pre-existing confidentiality agreements, Ron. Why is that so crucial for him if he is confirmed to this role?
Well, first, as was indicated, there have been some Federal Reserve officials and district presidents who were making comments or involved in decisions that directly affected their personal portfolio holdings, and some of them have since departed as a consequence of this. The Fed did not supervise well enough the investment holdings of some of their own people. Now, in the case of the Fed chair, if you have assets that could be influenced by the direction of interest rates, that is the last position you want the Fed chair to be in, particularly in a sizable set of holdings like his. Alan Greenspan, when he was Fed chair, I believe owned only T-bills. So basically a cash equivalent for the entire time he was chairman of the Federal Reserve, as did, I think, that was also the practice of his subsequent chairs. So you don't want someone to have $100 to $130 million worth of assets that might go up in value if he decides to cut interest rates dramatically. And conversely, you don't want him to not raise interest rates because that would hurt his holdings as well. You want those conflicts eliminated.
Just quickly, do you think his answers would satisfy senators on this? He says he's going to divest, but he's come up with an agreement with the Office of Government Ethics.
So if indeed, yes, he were to move them into, plain vanilla assets as he described them, yeah, I think that would be satisfactory. I mean, whether or not we delve into the details of what it is he owns, whether or not they were appropriate in any period prior, is a question that Elizabeth Warren was driving home, probably to a point of distraction.
The Federal Reserve has been independent since 1913. Over a century of presidents, Roswell, Nixon, Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, all of them tried to pressure it and ultimately respected boundary because they understood what happens when a government controls its own interest rates. You got Turkey, Argentina, Venezuela, inflation that wipes out savings overnight, currencies that collapse, economies that take decades to rebuild. The independence of Fed is not an academic principle. It is the single most important structural protection the American economy has against the government printing money to, so it's on political problems. Trump has called Powell an enemy, has publicly demanded rate cuts dozens of times, has floated firing him repeatedly, and now he has nominated someone for his position on interest rates conveniently aligned with exactly what Trump has been demanding. Elizabeth Warren called it installing a sock puppet. That description is either accurate or it is not. The next 18 months will answer that question with consequences that will affect every mortgage, every car loan, every credit card rate, every retirement account in America. The Iran war has already pushed the inflation to the highest rates in 2 years. Energy prices are up, food prices are up. The Fed's job right now is to respond to that with interest rate decisions based purely on economic data, not on what the White House wants, not on what would help president's approval rating, not on what would make the next election easy, just the data. Whether the next chair of the Federal Reserve is actually capable of doing that, given how he got job, is the most important economic question in America right now, and almost nobody is talking about it.